Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creep Smith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Welcome back, wildlings. See now it gets interesting. Well, more interesting. Warning: gratuitously grody and formidably fearsome fabling forthcoming. Continuing on in a tale of true terror, tonight's continuing calamity. The Last Illusion, by the High Hierophant of Horror, Clive Barker. All the way downstairs and in the hallway as Butterfield paid him off, Harry was willing Dorothy to contradict the lawyer and tell him she wanted Harry to stay. But she didn't even offer him a word of farewell as he was ushered out of the house. The $200 he'd been given were, of course, more than adequate recompense for the few hours of idleness that he had spent there, but he would happily have burned all the bills for one sign that Dorothea gave a damn they were parting. Quite clearly, she did not. On past experience, it would take his bruised ego a full 24 hours to recover from such indifference. He got out of the cab on 3rd, around 83rd Street, and walked through to a bar on Lexington where he knew he could put half a bottle of bourbon between himself and the dreams that he'd had. It was well after 1. The street was deserted except for him and for the echo his footsteps had recently acquired. He turned the corner into Lexington and waited. A few beats later, Valentin rounded that same corner. Harry took hold of him by his tie. "Not a bad noose," he said, hauling the man off his heels. Valentin made no attempt to free himself. "Oh, thank God you're alive," he said. "No thanks to you," Harry said. "What did you put in that drink?" "Nothing," Valentin insisted. "Why should I?" "So how come I found myself on the floor? How come the bad dreams?" "Butterfield," Valentin said. "Whatever you dreamt, he brought in with him, believe me. I panicked as soon as I heard him in the house. I admit it, I know I should have warned you, but I knew if I didn't get out quickly, I wouldn't get out at all." "Are you telling me that he would have killed you?" "Not personally, but yes." Harry looked incredulous. "We go way back, him and me." "Well, he's welcome to you," Harry said, letting go of the tie. "I'm too damn tired to take any more of this shit." He turned from Valentin and began to walk away. "Wait," said the other man. "I know I wasn't too sweet with you back at the house, but you've got to understand, things are going to get bad for both of us." "I thought you said it was all over but the shouting." "I thought it was. I thought we had it all sewn up. Then Butterfield arrived, and I realized how naive I was being. They're not going to let Swan rest in peace. Not now. Not ever. We have to save him, D'Amour." Harry stopped walking and studied the man's face. To pass him on the street, he mused, you wouldn't have taken him for a lunatic. "Did Butterfield go upstairs?" Valentin inquired. "Yes, he did. Why?" "Do you remember if he approached the casket?" Harry shook his head. "Good," said Valentin. "Then the defenses are holding, which gives us a little time. Swan was a fine tactician, you know, but he could be careless. That's how they caught him. Sheer carelessness. He knew they were coming for him. I told him outright. I said we should cancel the remaining performances and go home. At least he had some sanctuary there." "Do you think he was murdered?" "Jesus Christ," said Valentin, almost despairing of Harry. "Of course he was murdered." "So he's just past saving, right? The man's dead." "Dead? Yes. Past saving? No." "Do you talk gibberish to everyone?" Valentin put his hand on Harry's shoulder. "Oh no," he said with unfeigned sincerity. "I don't trust anyone the way I trust you." "Well, this is very sudden," said Harry. "May I ask why?" "Because you're in this up to your neck, the same way I am," Valentin replied. "No, I'm not," said Harry, but Valentin ignored the denial and went on with his talk. "At the moment, we don't know how many of them there are, of course. They might simply have sent Butterfield, but I think that's unlikely." "Wait, who is Butterfield with? The Mafia?" "We should be so lucky," said Valentin. He reached in his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "This is the woman Swan was with," he said, "the night at the theater. It's possible she knows something of their strength." "There was a witness?" "She didn't come forward, but yes, there was. I was his procurer. You see, I helped arrange his several adulteries so that none ever embarrassed him. See if you can get to her." He stopped abruptly. Somewhere close by, music was being played. It sounded like a drunken jazz band extemporizing on bagpipes, a wheezing, rambling cacophony. Valentin's face instantly became a portrait of distress. "Oh, God help us," he said, and began to back away from Harry. What's the problem?" "Do you know how to pray?" Valentin asked him as he retreated down 83rd Street. The volume of the music was rising with every interval. "I haven't prayed in 20 years, Harry replied. "Then learn," came the response, and Valentin turned to run. As he did so, a ripple of darkness moved down the street from the north, dimming the luster of the bar signs and the street lamps as it came. Neon announcements suddenly guttered and died. There were protests out of upstairs windows as the lights failed, and as if encouraged by the curses, the music took on a fresh and yet more hectic rhythm. Above his head, Harry heard a wailing sound, and looked up to see a ragged silhouette against the clouds which trailed tendrils like a man-o'-war as it descended upon the street, leaving the stench of rotting fish in its wake. Its target was very clearly Valentin. He shouted over the wail and the music and the panic from the blackout, but no sooner had he yelled than he heard Valentin shout out from the darkness, a pleading cry that was rudely cut short. He stood in the murk, his feet unwilling to carry him a step nearer the place from which the plea had come. The smell still stung his nostrils. Nosing it, his nausea returned, and then so did the lights, a wave of power igniting the lamps and the bar signs as it washed back down the street. It reached Harry, and he moved on to the spot where he had last seen Valentin. It was deserted. Indeed, the sidewalk was empty all the way down to the next intersection. The driveling jazz had stopped. Eyes peeled for man, beast, or the remnants of either, Harry wandered down the sidewalk. 20 yards from where he'd been standing, the concrete was wet. Not with blood, he was pleased to see. The fluid was the color of bile and stank to high heaven. Amongst the splashes were several slivers of what might have been human tissue. Evidently, Valentin had fought and succeeded in opening a wound on his attacker. There were more traces of the blood further down the sidewalk, as if the injured thing had crawled some way before taking flight again. With Valentin, presumably. In the face of such strength, Harry knew his meager powers would have availed him not at all, but he felt guilty nonetheless. He'd heard the cry, seen the assailant swoop, and yet fear had sealed his soles to the ground. He'd last felt fear the equal of this in Wyckoff Street, when Mimi Lomax's demon lover had finally thrown off any presence of humanity. The room had filled with the stink of ether and human dirt, and the demon had stood there in its appalling nakedness and shown him scenes that had turned his bowels to water. They were with him now, those scenes. They would be with him forever. He looked down at the scrap of paper Valentin had given him. The name and address had been rapidly scrawled, but they were just decipherable. A wise man, Harry reminded himself, would screw this note up and throw it down into the gutter. But if the events in Wyckoff Street had taught him anything, it was that once touched by such malignancy as he had seen and dreamt in the last few hours, there would be no casual disposal of it. He had to follow it to its source, however repugnant that thought was, and make with it whatever bargains the strength of his hand allowed. There was no good time to do business like this. The present would have to suffice. He walked back to Lexington and caught a cab to the address on the paper. He got no response from the bell marked Bernstein, but roused the doorman and engaged in a frustrating debate with him through the glass door. The man was angry to have been raised at such an hour. Miss Bernstein was not in her apartment, he insisted, and he remained untouched even when Harry intimated that there might be some life or death urgency in the matter. It was only when he produced his wallet that the fellow displayed the least flicker of concern. Finally, he let Harry in. "She's not up there," he said, pocketing the bills. "She's not been in for days." Harry took the elevator. His shins were aching, and his back, too. He wanted sleep. Bourbon, then sleep. There was no reply at the apartment, as the doorman had predicted, but he kept knocking and calling her. "Miss Bernstein, are you there?" There was no sign of life from within, not at least until he said, "I want to talk about Swan." He heard an intake of breath close to the door. "Is somebody there?" he asked. "Please, answer. There's nothing to be afraid of." After several seconds, a slurred and melancholy voice murmured, "Swan's dead." At least she wasn't, Harry thought. Whatever forces had snatched Valentin away, they had not yet reached this corner of Manhattan. "May I talk to you?" he requested. "No," she replied. Her voice was a candle flame on the verge of extinction. "Just a few questions, Barbara." "I'm in the tiger's belly," the slow reply came. "And it doesn't want me to let you in." Perhaps they had got here before him. "Can't you reach the door?" he coaxed her. "It's not so far." "But it's eaten me," she said. "Try, Barbara. The tiger won't mind. Reach." There was silence from the other side of the door, then a shuffling sound. Was she doing as he'd requested? It seemed so. He heard her fingers fumbling with the catch. "That's it," he encouraged her. "Can you turn it? Try to turn it." At the last instant he thought, suppose she's telling the truth and there is a tiger in there with her. It was too late for retreat. The door was opening. There was no animal in the hallway, just a woman and the smell of dirt. She clearly had neither washed nor changed her clothes since fleeing from the theater. The evening gown that she'd worn was soiled and torn. Her skin was gray with grime. He stepped into the apartment. She moved down the hallway away from him, desperate to avoid his touch. "It's all right," he said. "There's no tiger here." Her wide eyes were almost empty. What presence moved there was lost to sanity. "Oh, there is," she said. "I'm the tiger. I'm in it. Forever." As he had neither the time nor skill required to dissuade her from this madness, he decided it was wiser to go with it. "How did you get in there?" he asked her. Into the tiger. "Was it when you were with Swan?" She nodded. "You remember that, do you?" Oh, yes." "What do you remember?" "There was a sword. It fell. He was picking up..." She stopped and frowned. "Picking up what?" She seemed suddenly more distracted than ever. "Wait, how can you hear me?" she wondered, "when I'm in the tiger? Are you in the tiger too?" "Maybe I am," he said, not wanting to analyze the metaphor too closely. "Well, we're here forever, you know," she informed him. "We'll never be let out." "Who told you that?" She didn't reply, but cocked her head a little. "Can you hear?" she asked. "Hear?" She took another step back down the hallway. Harry listened, but he could hear nothing. The growing agitation on Barbara's face was sufficient to send him back to the front door and open it, however. The elevator was in operation. He could hear its soft hum across the landing. Worse, the lights in the hallway and on the stairs were deteriorating, the bulbs losing power with every foot the elevator ascended. He turned back into the apartment and went to take hold of Barbara's wrist. She made no protest. Her eyes were fixed on the doorway through which she seemed to know her judgment would come. "Come on, we'll take the stairs," he told her, and led her out onto the landing. The lights were within an ace of falling. He glanced up at the floor numbers being ticked off above the elevator doors. Was this the top floor they were on, or one shy of it? He couldn't remember, and there was no time to think before the lights were out entirely. He stumbled across the unfamiliar territory of the landing with the girl in tow, hoping to God that he'd find the stairs before the elevator reached this floor. Barbara wanted to loiter, but he bullied her to pick up her pace. As his foot found the top stair, the elevator finished its ascent. The doors hissed open and a cold fluorescent washed the landing. He couldn't see its source, nor did he wish to, but its effect was to reveal to the naked eye every stain and blemish, every sign of decay and creeping rot that the paintwork sought to camouflage. The show stole Harry's attention for a moment only, and then he took a firmer hold of the woman's hand, and they began their descent. Barbara was not interested in escape, however, but in events on the landing. Thus occupied, she tripped and fell heavily against Harry. The two would have toppled, but that he caught hold of the banister. Angered, he turned to her. They were out of sight of the landing, but the light crept down the stairs and washed over Barbara's face. Beneath its uncharitable scrutiny, Harry saw decay busy in her. He saw rot in her teeth and death in her skin and hair and nails. No doubt he would have appeared much the same to her, but were she to look. But she was still staring back over her shoulder and up the stairs. The light source was on the move, and voices accompanied it. "The door's open," a woman said. "What are you waiting for?" a voice replied. It was Butterfield. Harry held both breath and wrist as the light source moved again towards the door, presumably, but then it was partially eclipsed as it disappeared into the apartment. "We have to be quick," he told Barbara. She went with him down 3 or 4 steps, and then, without warning, her hand leapt for his face, nails opening his cheek. He let go of her hand to protect himself, and in that instant she was away, back up the stairs. He cursed and stumbled in pursuit of her, but her former sluggishness had lifted. She was startlingly nimble. By the dregs of light from the landing, he watched her reach the top of the stairs and disappear from sight. "Here I am," she called out as she went. He stood immobile on the stairway, unable to decide whether to go or to stay, and so unable to move at all. Ever since Wyckoff Street, he'd hated stairs. Momentarily, the light from above flared up, throwing the shadows of the banisters across him. Then it died again. He put his hand to his face. She had raised welts, but there was little blood. What could he hope from her if he went to her aid? Only more of the same. She was a lost cause. Even as he despaired of her, he heard a sound from round the corner at the head of the stairs, a soft sound that might have been either a footstep or a sigh. Had she escaped their influence after all? Or perhaps not even reached the apartment door, but thought better of it and about turned. Even as he was weighing up the odds, he heard her say, "Help me." There was a ghost of a ghost, but it was indisputably her, and she was in terror. He reached for his .38 and started up the stairs again. Even before he'd turned the corner, he felt the nape of his neck itch as his hackles rose. She was there, but so was the tiger. It stood on the landing mere feet from Harry, its body humming with latent power. Its eyes were molten, its open maw impossibly large, and there, already in its throat, was Barbara. He met her eyes out of the tiger's mouth and saw a flicker of comprehension in them that was worse than any madness. The beast threw its head back and forth to settle its prey in its gut. She'd been swallowed whole, apparently. There was no blood on the landing, nor about the tiger's muzzle, only the appalling sight of the girl's face disappearing down the tunnel of the animal's throat. She loosed a final cry from the belly of the thing as it rose, and it seemed to Harry that the beast attempted a grin, its face crinkled up grotesquely, the eyes narrowing like those of a laughing Buddha. the lips peeling back to expose the sickle of brilliant teeth. Behind this display, the cry was finally hushed. In that instant, the tiger leapt. Harry fired into its devouring bulk, and as the shot met its flesh, the leer and the maw and the whole striped mass unwove in a single beat. Suddenly, it was gone, and there was only a drizzle of pastel confetti spiraling down around him. The shot had aroused interest. There were raised voices in one or two of the apartments, and the light that had accompanied Butterfield from the elevator was brightening through the open door of the Bernstein residence. He was almost tempted to stay and see the light bringer, but discretion bettered his curiosity, and he turned and made his descent, taking the stairs 2 and 3 at a time. The confetti tumbled after him as if it had a life of its own. Barbara's life, perhaps, transferred into the paper pieces and tossed away. He reached the lobby, breathless. The doorman was standing there, staring up the stairs vacantly. "Somebody get shot?" he inquired. "No," said Harry. "Eaten." As he headed for the door, he heard the elevator start to hum as it descended. Perhaps merely a tenant coming down for a pre-dawn stroll? Perhaps not. He left the doorman as he had found him, sullen and confused, and made his escape into the street, putting 2 block lengths between him and the apartment building before he stopped running. They did not bother to come after him. He was beneath their concern, most likely. So what was he to do now? Valentin was dead, Barbara Bernstein too. He was none the wiser now that he'd been at the outset, except that he'd learned again the lesson that he'd been taught in Wyckoff Street, that when dealing with the Gulfs, it was wiser never to believe your eyes. The moment you trusted your senses, the moment you believed a tiger to be a tiger, you were half theirs. Not a complicated lesson, but it seemed he had forgotten it like a fool, and it had taken 2 deaths to teach it him afresh. Maybe it would be simpler to have the rule tattooed on the back of his hand, so that he couldn't check the time without being reminded, never believe your eyes. The principle was still fresh in his mind as he walked back towards the apartment, and a man stepped out of the doorway and said, "Harry." It looked like Valentin, a wounded Valentin, a Valentin who'd been dismembered and sewn together again by a committee of blind surgeons, but the same man, in essence. But the tiger had looked like a tiger, hadn't it? "It's me," he said. "Oh, no," Harry said. "Not this time." "What are you talking about? It's Valentin." "So, prove it." The other man looked puzzled. "This is no time for games," he said. "We're in desperate straits here." Harry took his .38 from his pocket and pointed it at Valentin's chest. "Prove it, or I'll shoot you," he said. "Are you out of your mind? I saw you torn apart." "Not quite," said Valentin. His left arm was swathed in makeshift bandaging from fingertip to mid-bicep. "It was touch and go," he said. "But everything has its Achilles heel. It's just a question of finding the right spot." Harry peered at the man. He wanted to believe that this was indeed Valentin, but it was too incredible to believe that the frail form in front of him could have survived the monstrosity that he'd seen on 83rd Street. No, this was another illusion, like the tiger, paper, and malice. The man broke Harry's train of thought. "Your steak," he said. My what?" "You like it almost burned," Valentin said. "I protested, remember?" Harry remembered. "Go on," he said. "And you said you hated the sight of blood, even if it wasn't your own." "Yes," said Harry. His doubts were lifting. "That's right." "You asked me to prove that I'm Valentin. That's the best I can do right now." Harry was almost persuaded. "In God's name," Valentin said, "do we have to debate this standing in the middle of the street?" "You'd better come in." The apartment was small, but tonight it felt more stifling than ever. Valentin sat himself down with a good view of the door. He'd refused spirits or first aid. Harry helped himself to bourbon. He was on his third shot when Valentin finally said, "We have to go back to the house, Harry." "What?" "We have to claim Swan's body before Butterfield." "I did my best already. It's not my business anymore." "So you can leave Swan to the pit?" "She doesn't care. Why should I?" "Do you mean Dorothea?" "She doesn't know what Swan was involved with. That's why she's so trusting. She has suspicions, maybe, but insofar as it's possible to be guiltless in all of this, she is." He paused to adjust the position of his injured arm. "She was a prostitute, you know. I don't suppose she told you that. Swan once said to me that he married her because only prostitutes know the value of love." Harry let this apparent paradox go. "Why did she stay with him then?" he asked. "He wasn't exactly faithful, was he?" "She loved him," Valentin replied. "It's not unheard of." "And you?" "Oh, I loved him too, in spite of his stupidities. That's why we have to help him. If Butterfield and his associates get their hands on Swan's mortal remains, there will be hell to pay." "I know. I got a glimpse at the Bernstein place." "What did you see?" "Something and nothing," said Harry. "A tiger, I thought, only it wasn't." The old paraphernalia," Valentin commented. "And there was something else. Something with Butterfield. Something that shed light. I didn't see what." "That's the castrato," Valentin muttered to himself, clearly discomfited. "We'll have to be careful." He stood up, the movement causing him to wince. "I think we should be on our way, Harry." "Are you paying me for this?" Harry inquired, "or am I doing all of this for love?" "You're doing it because of what happened at Wyckoff Street," came the softly spoken reply. "Because you lost your poor Mimi Lomax to the gulfs and you don't want to lose Swan. That is, if you haven't already done so." They caught a cab on Madison Avenue and headed back uptown to 61st Street, keeping their silence as they rode. Harry had 100 questions to ask of Valentin. Who was Butterfield, for one, and what was Swan's crime that he had to be pursued to death and beyond? So many puzzles, but Valentin looked sick and unfit for plying with questions. Besides, Harry sensed that the more he knew, the less enthusiastic he'd be about the journey they were now taking. "We have, perhaps, one advantage," Valentin said as they approached 61st Street. "They can't be expecting this frontal attack. Butterfield presumes I'm dead and probably thinks you're hiding your head in mortal terror." "I'm working on it." "You're not in danger," Valentin replied. "At least, not the way Swan is. If they were to take you apart limb by limb, it would be nothing beside the torments that they have waiting for the magician." "Illusionist," Harry corrected him, but Valentin shook his head. Magician he was. Magician he'll always be. The driver interrupted before Harry could quote Dorothea on the subject. "What number you people want?" he said. "Just drop us right here, on the right," Valentin instructed him. "And wait for us, understand?" "Sure." Valentin turned to Harry. "Give the man $50. "50? Do you want him to wait, or not?" Harry counted 4 tens and 10 singles into the driver's hand. "You'd better keep the engine running," he said. Anything to oblige," the driver grinned. Harry joined Valentin on the sidewalk, and they walked the 25 yards to the house. The street was still noisy despite the hour. The party that Harry had seen in preparation half a night ago was at its height. There was no sign of life at the Swan residence, however. "Perhaps they don't expect us," Harry thought. "Certainly this head-on assault was about the most foolhardy tactic imaginable, and as such might catch the enemy off guard. But were such forces ever really off guard? Was there ever a minute in their maggoty lives when their eyelids drooped and sleep tamed them for a space? No. No, in Harry's experience, it was only the good who ever needed sleep. Iniquity and its practitioners were awake every single eager moment, planning fresh felonies. "How do we get in?" he asked as they stood outside the house. "I have the key," Valentin replied, and went to the door. There was no retreat now. The key was turned, the door was open, and they were stepping out of the comparative safety of the street. The house was as dark within as it had appeared from without. There was no sound of human presence on any of the floors. Was it possible that the defenses Swan had laid around his corpse had indeed rebuffed Butterfield, and that he and his cohorts had retreated? Valentin quashed such misplaced optimism, almost immediately taking hold of Harry's arm and leaning close to whisper, "They're here." This was not the time to ask Valentin how he knew, but Harry made a mental note to inquire when, or rather, if they got out of the house with their tongues still in their heads. Valentin was already on the stairs. Harry, his eyes still accustoming themselves to the vestigial light that crept in from the street, crossed the hallway after him. The other man moved confidently in the gloom, and Harry was glad of it. Without Valentin plucking at his sleeve and guiding him around the half-landing, he might have crippled himself. Despite what Valentin had said, there was no more sound or sight of occupancy up here than there had been below, but as they advanced toward the master bedroom, where Swan lay, a rotten tooth in Harry's lower jaw that had lately been quiescent began to throb afresh, and his bowels ached to break wind. The anticipation was crucifying. He'd felt a barely suppressible urge to yell out and to oblige the enemy to show its hand, if indeed it had hands to show. Valentin had reached the door. He turned his head in Harry's direction, and even in the murk it was apparent that fear was taking its toll on him, too. His skin glistened, and he stank of fresh sweat. He pointed towards the door. Harry nodded. He was as ready as he was ever going to be. Valentin reached for the door handle, and the sound of the lock mechanism seemed deafeningly loud, but it brought no response from anywhere in the house. The door swung open, and the heady scent of flowers met them. They'd begun to decay in the forced heat of the house. There was a rankness beneath the perfume. More welcome than the scent was the light. The curtains in the room had not been entirely drawn, and the street lamps described the interior. The flowers massed like clouds around the casket, the chair where Harry had sat, the Calvados bottle beside it, the mirror above the fireplace showing the room its secret self. Valentin was already moving across to the casket, and Harry heard him sigh as he set his eyes on his old master. He wasted little time, but immediately set to lifting the lower half of the casket lid. It defeated his single arm, however, and Harry went to his assistance, eager to get the job done and be away. Touching the solid wood of the casket brought his nightmare back with breath-snatching force. The pit opening beneath him, the illusionist rising from his bed like a sleeper unwillingly woken. There was no such spectacle now, however. Indeed, a little life in the corpse might have made the job easier. Swan was a big man, and his limp body was uncooperative to a fault. The simple action of lifting him from his casket took all their breath and attention. He came at last, though reluctantly, his long limbs flopping about. "Now," said Valentin, "downstairs." As they moved to the door, something in the street ignited, or so it seemed, for the interior suddenly brightened. The light was not kind to their burden. It revealed the crudity of the cosmetics applied to Swan's face and the burgeoning putrescence beneath. Harry had an instant only to appreciate these felicities, and then the light brightened again, and he realized that it wasn't outside, but in. He looked up at Valentin and almost despaired. The luminescence was even less charitable to the servant than to his master. It seemed to strip the very flesh away from Valentin's face. Harry caught only a glimpse of what it revealed beneath. Events stole his attention an instant later, but he saw enough to know that had Valentin not been his accomplice in this venture, he might well have run from him. "Get out of here!" Valentin yelled. He let go of Swan's legs, leaving Harry to steer Swan single-handed. The corpse proved recalcitrant, however. Harry had only made 2 cursing steps toward the exit when things took a turn for the cataclysmic. He heard Valentin unloose an oath and looked up to see that the mirror had given up all pretense to reflection and that something was moving up from its liquid depths, bringing the light with it. "What is it?" Harry breathed. "The castrato," came the reply. "Will you go?" There was no time to obey Valentin's panicked instruction. However, before the hidden thing broke the plane of the mirror and invaded the room, Harry had been wrong. It did not carry the light with it as it came. It was the light, or rather some holocaust blazed in its bowels, the glare of which had escaped through the creature's body by whatever route it could. It had once been human, a mountain of a man with the belly and breasts of a Neolithic Venus, but the fire in its body had twisted it out of true, breaking out through its palms and its navel, burning its mouth and its nostrils into one ragged hole. It had, as its name implied, been unsexed, and from that hole too light spilled. By it the decay of the flowers speeded into seconds. The blossoms withered and died. The room was filled in moments with the stench of rotting vegetable matter. Harry had heard Valentin call his name once and again. Only then did he remember the body in his arms. He dragged his eyes from the hovering castrato and carried Swan another yard. The door was at his back and open. He dragged his burden out into the landing as the castrato kicked over the casket. He heard the din and then the shouts from Valentin. There followed another terrible commotion and the high-pitched voice of the castrato talking through that hole in its face. "Die and be happy," it said, and a hail of furniture was flung against the wall with such force chairs embedded themselves in the plaster. Valentin had escaped the assault, however, or so it seemed. For an instant later, Harry heard the castrato shriek. It was an appalling sound, pitiful and revolting. He would have stopped his ears, but that he had his hands full. He had almost reached the top of the stairs. Dragging Swan a few steps further, he laid the body down. The castrato's light was not dimmed despite its complaints. It still flickered on the bedroom wall like a midsummer thunderstorm. For the 3rd time tonight, once on 83rd Street and again in the stairs of the Bernstein place, Harry hesitated. If he went back to help Valentin, perhaps there would be worse sights to see than ever Wyckoff Street had offended, but there would be no retreat this time. Without Valentin, he was lost. He raced back down the landing and flung open the door. The air was thick, the lamps rocking. In the middle of the room hung the castrato, still defying gravity. It had hold of Valentin by his hair. Its other hand was poised, first and middle fingers spread like twin horns, about to stab out its captive's eyes. Harry pulled his .38 from his pocket, aimed, and fired. He'd always been a bad shot when given more than a moment to take aim, but in extremis, when instinct governed rational thought, he wasn't half bad. This was just such an occasion. The bullet found the castrato's neck and opened another wound. More in surprise than pain, perhaps, it let Valentin go. There was a leakage of light from the hole in its neck, and it put its hand to that place. Valentin was quickly on his feet. "Again!" he called to Harry. "Fire again!" Harry obeyed the instruction. His second bullet pierced the creature's chest, his third its belly. This last wound seemed particularly traumatic. The distended flesh, ripe for bursting, broke, and the trickle of light that spilled from the wound rapidly became a flood as the abdomen split. Again the castrato howled, this time in panic, and lost all control of its flight. It reeled like a pricked balloon towards the ceiling, its fat hands desperately attempting to stem the mutiny in its substance. But it had reached critical mass. There was no making good the damage done. Lumps of its flesh began to break from it. Valentin, either too stunned or fascinated, stood staring up at the disintegration while rains of cooked meat fell around him. Harry took hold of him and hauled him back towards the door. The castrato was finally earning its name, unloosing a desolate, ear-piercing note. Harry didn't want to watch its demise, but slammed the bedroom door as the voice reached an awesome pitch and the windows smashed. Valentin was grinning. "Do you know what we just did?" he said. "Never mind. Let's just get the fuck out of here." The sight of Swan's corpse at the top of the stairs seemed to chasten Valentin. Harry instructed him to assist, and he did so as efficiently as his dazed condition allowed. Together they began to escort the illusionist down the stairs. As they reached the front door, there was a final shriek from above as the castrato came apart at the seams. Then silence. The commotion had not gone unnoticed. Revelers had appeared from the house opposite. A crowd of late-night pedestrians had assembled on the sidewalk. "Some party," one of them said as the trio emerged. Harry had half expected the cab to have deserted them, but he had reckoned without the driver's curiosity. The man was out of his vehicle and staring up at the first-floor window. "Does he need a hospital?" he asked as they bundled Swan into the back of the cab. "No," Harry returned. "He's about as good as he's going to get." "Will you drive?" said Valentin. "Sure, just tell me where to." "Anywhere," came the weary reply. "Just get out of here." "Hold it a minute," the driver said. "I don't want any trouble." "Then you'd better move," said Valentin. The driver met his passenger's gaze. Whatever he saw there, his next words were, "I'm driving," and they took off along East 61st like the proverbial bat out of hell. "We did it, Harry," Valentin said when they'd been traveling for a few minutes. "We got him back." "And the thing? Tell me about it." "Oh, the castrato? What's to tell? Butterfield must have left it as a watchdog until he could bring the technician to decode Swan's defense mechanisms. We were lucky. It was in need of milking. That makes them unstable." "Okay. How do you know so much about all this?" "It's a long story," said Valentin, "and not for a cab ride." "So what now? We can't drive around in circles all night?" Valentin looked across at the body that sat between them, prey to every whim of the cab's suspension and the road mender's craft. Gently he put Swan's hand on his lap. "You're right, of course," he said. "We have to make arrangements for the cremation, as swiftly as possible." The cab bounced across a pothole. Valentin's face tightened. Are you in pain?" Harry asked him. "I've been in worse." "We could go back to my apartment, rest there." Valentin shook his head. "Not very clever," he said. "It's the first place they'll look." "My offices, then?" "Second." "Well, Jesus, this cab's going to run out of gas eventually." At this point, the driver intervened. "Say, did you people mention a cremation?" "Maybe," Valentin replied. "Only, my brother-in-law's got a funeral business out in Queens." "Is that so?" said Harry. "Very reasonable rates. I can recommend him. No shit." "Could you contact him now?" Valentin said. "It's 2 a.m. We're in a hurry." The driver reached up and adjusted his mirror. He was looking at Swan. "You, don't mind me asking, do you? But is that a body you got back there in my cab?" "It is," said Harry, and he's getting impatient. The driver made a whooping sound. "Shit," he said. I've had a woman drop twins in that seat. I've had whores do business. I even had an alligator back there one time, but this beats them all. He pondered for a moment and then said, You kill him, did you? No, said Harry. Guess we'd be heading for the East River if you had, huh? That's right. We just want a decent cremation. And quickly, please. Yeah, that's, understandable. What's your name? Harry asked him. Winston Jowett, but everybody calls me Byron. I'm a poet, see? Leastways, I am at weekends. Byron. Byron? See, any other driver would be freaked out, right? Finding two guys with a body in the back seat, but the way I see it, it's all material for the poems. Right, said Byron. The muse is a fickle mistress. You have to take it where you find it, you know? Speaking of which, you gentlemen got any idea where you want to go? Make it your office, then, Valentin told Harry, and he can call his brother-in-law. Good, said Harry. Then, to Byron, head west along 45th Street to 8th. You got it, said Byron, and the cab's speed doubled in the space of 20 yards. Say, he said, you fellas fancy a poem? Now, said Harry. I like to improvise, Byron replied. Pick a subject, any subject. Valentin hugged his wounded arm close. Quietly, he said, how about the end of the world? Good subject, the poet replied. Just give me a minute or two. So soon? Asked Valentin. They took a circuitous route to the offices while Byron Jowett tried a selection of rhymes for apocalypse. The sleepwalkers were out on 45th Street in search of one high or another. Some sat in the doorways. One lay sprawled across the sidewalk. None of them gave the cab or its occupants more than the briefest perusal. Harry unlocked the front door, and he and Byron carried Swan up to the 3rd floor. The office was a home away from home, cramped and chaotic. They put Swan in the swivel chair behind the furred coffee cups and the alimony demands heaped on the desk. He looked easily the healthiest of the quartet. Byron was sweating like a bull after the climb. Harry felt and surely looked as though he hadn't slept in 60 days. Valentin sat slumped in the client's chair, so drained of vitality he might have been at death's door. You look terrible, Harry told him. No matter. It'll all be done soon. Harry turned to Byron. How about calling this brother-in-law of yours? While Byron set to doing so, Harry returned his attention to Valentin. I've got a first aid box somewhere about here, he said. Shall I bandage up that arm? Thank you, but no. Like you, I hate the sight of blood, especially my own. Byron was on the phone chastising his brother-in-law for his ingratitude. What's your beef? I got your client. I know the time, for Christ's sake, but business is business. Tell him we'll pay double his normal rate, Valentin said. You hear that, Mal? Twice your normal fee. So get over here, will you? He gave the address to his brother-in-law and put down the receiver. He's coming over, he announced. Now, said Harry. Now. Byron glanced at his watch. My belly thinks my throat's cut. How about we eat? You got an all-night place near here? There's one block down from here. You want some food? Byron asked Valentin. I don't think so, he said. He was looking worse by the moment. Okay, Byron said to Harry. Just you and me, then. You got a 10 I could borrow? Harry gave him a bill, the keys to the street door, and an order for donuts and coffee, and sent Byron on his way. Only when he'd gone did Harry wish that he'd convinced the poet to stave off his hunger pangs a while. The office was distressingly quiet without him. Swan in residence behind the desk, Valentin succumbing to sleep in the other chair. The hush brought to mind another such silence. during that last awesome night at the Lomax house when Mimi's demon lover, wounded by Father Heese, had slipped away into the walls for a while and left them waiting and waiting, knowing it would come back, but not certain of when or how. 6 hours they'd sat, Mimi occasionally breaking the silence with laughter or gibberish, and the first Harry had known of its return was the smell of cooking excrement and Mimi's cry of "Sodomite!" as he surrendered to an act his faith had too long forbidden him. There had been no more silence then, not for a long space. Only Heese's cries and Harry's pleas for forgetfulness. They had all gone unanswered. It seemed that he could hear the demon's voice now, its demands, its invitations, but no, it was only Valentin. The man was tossing his head back and forth in his sleep, his face knotted up. Suddenly he started from his chair, one word on his lips. "Swan!" His eyes opened, and as they alighted on the illusionist's body, which was propped in the chair opposite, tears came uncontrollably, racking him. "He's dead," he said, as though in his dream he'd forgotten that bitter fact. "I failed him, D'Amour. That's why he's dead. Because of my negligence." "You're doing your best for him now," Harry said, though he knew the words were poor compensation. "Nobody could ask for a better friend." "I was never his friend," Valentin said, staring at the corpse with brimming eyes. "I always hoped he'd one day trust me entirely, but he never did." "Why not?" "He couldn't afford to trust anybody, not in his situation." He wiped his cheeks with the back of his hand. "Maybe," Harry said, "it's about time you told me what this is all about." "If you want to hear." "I want to hear." "Very well," said Valentin. 32 years ago, Swan made a bargain with the Gulfs. He agreed to be an ambassador for them if they, in return, gave him magic. Magic? The ability to perform miracles, to transform matter, bewitch souls, even to drive out God. That's a miracle? "It's more difficult than you think," Valentin replied. "So Swan was a genuine magician?" "Indeed he was." "Then why didn't he use his powers?" "He did," Valentin replied. "He used them every night, at every performance." Harry was baffled. "I don't follow." "Nothing that the Prince of Lies offers to humankind is of the least value," Valentin said, "or it wouldn't be offered. Swan didn't know that when he first made his covenant, but he soon learned. Miracles are useless. Magic is a distraction from the real concerns. It's rhetoric, melodrama." "So what exactly are the real concerns?" "You ought to know that better than I," Valentin replied. "Fellowship, maybe? Curiosity? Certainly it matters not the least if water can be made into wine or Lazarus to live another year." Harry saw the wisdom of this, but not how it had brought the magician to Broadway. As it was, he didn't need to ask. Valentin had taken up the story afresh. His tears had cleared with the telling. Some trace of animation had crept back into his features. "It didn't take Swan long to realize that he sold his soul for a mess of pottage," he explained. "And when he did, he was inconsolable. At least, he was for a while. Then he began to contrive a revenge." "How?" "By taking Hell's name in vain. By using the magic which it boasted of as a trivial entertainment, degrading the power of the Gulfs by passing off their wonder-working as mere illusion. It was, you see, an act of heroic perversity. Every time a trick of Swan's was explained away as sleight of hand, the Gulfs squirmed." "Why didn't they kill him?" Harry said. "Oh, they tried, many times. But he had allies, agents in their camp who warned him of their plots against him. He escaped their retribution for years that way. Until now?" "Until now," Valentin sighed. "He was careless, and so was I. Now he's dead. and the gulfs are itching for him. I see. But we were not entirely unprepared for this eventuality. He made his apologies to heaven, and I dare hope that he's been forgiven his trespasses. Pray that he has. There's more than his salvation at stake tonight. What, yours too? All of us who loved him are tainted, Valentin replied. But if we can destroy his physical remains before the gulfs claim them, we may yet avoid the consequences of his covenant. Why did you wait so long? Why didn't you just cremate him the day he died? The lawyers aren't fools. The covenant specifically prescribes a period of lying in state. If we had attempted to ignore that clause, his soul would have been forfeited automatically. So when is this period up? 3 hours ago, midnight, Valentin replied. That's why they're so desperate, you see, and so dangerous. Another poem came to Byron Jowett as he ambled back up 8th Avenue, working his way through a tuna salad sandwich. His muse was not to be rushed. Poems could take as long as 5 minutes to be finalized, longer if they involved a double rhyme. He didn't hurry on his journey back to the offices, therefore, but wandered in a dreamy sort of mood, turning the lines every which way to make them fit. That way he hoped to arrive back with another finished poem. 2 in one night was a goddamn good go. He'd not perfected the final couplet, however, by the time he reached the open door. Operating on automatic pilot, he fumbled in his pocket for the keys D'Amour had loaned him, and let himself in. He was about to close the door again when a woman stepped through the gap, smiling at him. She was a beauty, and Byron, being a poet, was a fool for beauty. "Please," she said to him, "I need your help." "What can I do for you?" said Byron through a mouthful of food. "Do you know a man by the name of D'Amour? Harry D'Amour?" "Indeed I do. I'm going up to his place right now." "Oh, perhaps you could show me the way," the woman asked him, as Byron closed the door. "Be my pleasure," he said, and led her across the lobby to the bottom of the stairs. "You know, you're very sweet," she told him, and Byron melted. Valentin stood at the window. "Something wrong?" Harry asked. "Just a feeling," Valentin commented. "I have a suspicion maybe the devil's in Manhattan." "So, what's new?" "That maybe he's coming for us." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Harry jumped. "It's all right," Valentin said. "He never knocks." Harry went to the door, feeling like a fool. "Is that you, Byron?" he asked before unlocking it. "Please," said a voice he thought he'd never hear again. "Help me." He opened the door. It was Dorothea, of course. She was colorless as water and as unpredictable. Even before Harry had invited her across the office threshold, a dozen expressions or hints of such had crossed her face. Anguish, suspicion, terror. And now, as her eyes alighted upon the body of her beloved Swan, relief and gratitude. "Oh, you do have him," she said, stepping into the office. Harry closed the door. There was a chill from up the stairs. "Thank God, thank God." She took Harry's face in her hands and kissed him lightly on the lips. Only then did she notice Valentin. She dropped her hands. "What is he doing here?" she asked. "He's with me, with us." She looked doubtful. "No," she said. "We can trust him." "I said no. Get him out, Harry." There was a cold fury in her. She shook with it. "Get him out." Valentin stared at her, glassy-eyed. "The lady doth protest too much," he murmured. Dorothea put her fingers to her lips, as if to stifle another further outburst. "I'm sorry," she said, turning back to Harry, "but you must be told what this man is capable of. Without him, your husband would still be at the house, Mrs. Swan," Harry pointed out. He's the one you should be grateful to, not me. At this, Dorothea's expression softened through bafflement to a new gentility. "Oh," she said. Now she looked back at Valentin. "I'm sorry. When you ran from the house, I assumed some complicity." "With whom?" Valentin inquired. She made a tiny shake of her head, then said, "Oh, your arm. Are you hurt?" "A minor injury," he returned. "But—" "I've already tried to get it rebandaged," Harry said, "but the bastard's too stubborn." "Stubborn I am," Valentin replied without inflection. "But we'll be finished here soon," said Harry. Valentin broke in. "Don't tell her anything," he snapped. "Okay, I had heard that the Big Apple's gone downhill in the last 2 years, but damn, I don't think anyone would be ready for that kind of hell. Stay scared, wildlings. Never let a lawyer pay you off without knowing what's really happening, and make the most of your nights."